The Galactic Council couldn't understand why every alien feared humanity. The summons had no subject line. Just a time stamp, a chamber number, and 7 official seals pressed into the notification header like a formal threat wearing diplomatic clothing. 0300 station time. No explanation, no context, just be there. I was already awake when it arrived. 3 years on relay station Orin had cured me of sleeping past 2. The station hummed at a frequency that was not quite sound and not quite vibration. It was something in between that got into your molars and stayed there. You adapted or you transferred. I had adapted. I showed up in yesterday's clothes with a thermos of coffee that had been sitting on the burner since noon. It smelled like someone had made a threat to coffee and then followed through on it. I drank it anyway. I had been a trauma nurse for 6 years before I had been a diplomat. I had a high tolerance for things that should have been abandoned. The council chamber was built for exactly the kind of meeting they were about to have with me. High ceilings, 7 tiers of curved seating arranged in a perfect semicircle, each tier occupied by a different species and their respective support staff. The lighting was calibrated to be comfortable for all attending species simultaneously, which meant it was slightly wrong for all of them. Pale gold, slightly too warm for human eyes, slightly too dim for Volkai, slightly too uniform for the faceted vision of the Dreth. Nobody had ever accused the Galactic Council of making anyone feel at home. I took the single seat at the center of the floor. It was a human chair. They had one brought in, which I noticed. They had known I was coming long enough to arrange furniture. That was information. Councillor Veth spoke first. He always did. In my 3 years of diplomatic rotations, I had never once seen Veth let another councillor open a session. He was the oldest living Sethani on record, which meant he had been studying the behavior of civilization since before my planet had figured out writing. He had 8 limbs, 3 of which he used to gesture when he spoke, giving the impression that his entire body was arguing with itself in a language that predated language. He said, in the careful measured cadence that translation software rendered as smooth and almost warm, "Delegate Voss, thank you for attending on short notice." "Of course," I said. "We have questions." I figured. One of his secondary limbs moved. I had learned by that point that this was the Sethani equivalent of clearing your throat, a preparatory gesture. Something significant was incoming. "Humanity," he said, "presents an anomalous threat classification. We require clarification." I sipped my terrible coffee. He pulled the file. They put it on the main display, which was sized for a room that held 7 species and was therefore, from my seat, approximately the size of a house. Humanity's complete xenodiplomacy dossier, rendered in holographic type across 15 meters of air. I had never seen my own species file before. It was not a comfortable experience. The data was organized by category. Biological metrics first. Lifespan embarrassingly short. Physical resilience below the council average for 7 of 11 standard benchmarks. No biological enhancements on record. No psionic capability. No hive mind redundancy. Propulsion technology, mid-tier. Weapon systems, functional not exceptional. Population spread, limited, relatively speaking, to 43 colonized systems after 200 years of spacefaring. By every measurable standard, we were mid-table. Then Councillor Veth scrolled to the last section. Threat classification, undefined, do not escalate. I read that twice. Undefined was not a category they used for species that scared them. I knew the Council's classification system. Threatening species got tiered rankings. Tier 1 through 6, calibrated by capability, temperament, and resource competition. The Volkai clans were Tier 3. The Pale Architects, ancient and vast and operating on timelines that made the Council nervous, were Tier 2. Undefined was the category they used when the classification system itself broke down. When a species did not fit inside the framework that the framework was built to contain. We have conducted 3 independent assessments, Veth said, across 7 years of observation. All 3 returned the same classification. Our analysts describe your species as, and I translate directly, a variable we cannot assign a value to. The chamber was very quiet. The Volkai warrior clans, Veth continued, who have not filed a formal fear assessment in 400 years, submitted one regarding humanity 18 months ago. The Dreth Collective, which processes all data through consensus logic, returned a non-consensus result for the first time in recorded history when asked to evaluate humanity's trajectory. The Pale Architects, who have observed the rise and fall of 62 civilizations, requested, through channels they have not used in 2 centuries, that humanity be discussed at formal council level before any further contact escalation. He let that land. I let it land with him. The Pale Architects had not asked the council for anything in 200 years. They did not ask. They observed. They were the kind of ancient that made asking feel quaint, and they had broken 2 centuries of silence to make sure humanity was on the agenda. I set down my thermos. What exactly, I said, did you think we were going to do? The silence in the chamber had a texture to it. The kind of silence that happens when a question lands in a room and nobody is certain whether it is the beginning of an answer or a different kind of problem entirely. Veth's secondary limbs went still. That, he said quietly, is precisely what we are trying to determine. I looked at the file on the wall. My species, reduced to metrics and classifications and an empty field where a threat value should have been. I thought we have not even tried yet. I thought, bless their hearts. All right, I said, walk me through what you have. I will tell you what I can. They had 17 documented incidents. Veth presented them in chronological order, which I appreciated. It meant he was trying to understand them, not build a case. There is a difference between those 2 approaches that most people, human or otherwise, never learn to recognize. Veth was 8,000 years old and had learned it a long time ago. I listened to the first 3 incidents with my hands wrapped around my cold thermos and my face arranged into the expression I had developed over 6 years of trauma nursing. The one that says, I am taking this seriously without falling apart. It is a useful expression. I wore it every day in this job. The first incident was the Kepler 442b blockade. Veth described it in the precise, neutrally phrased language of council documentation. A human colony of 4,000 settlers, established on Kepler 442b. A territorial dispute between the Volkai clans and the Sithani expanse had resulted in all supply lines to the colony being severed as a strategic pressure tactic. Neither party had targeted the colonists directly. They had simply become, in the language of the report, collateral resource casualties. Volkai probability models at the time had calculated extinction of the colony within 4 months. The math was not subtle. 4,000 humans, sealed in with what they had on hand, on a planet that had not yet reached agricultural self-sufficiency. I already knew what happened next. I had studied the Kepler case in my 3rd year of xenodiplomacy training, but I listened to Veth describe it, and I watched his 3 active limbs move very carefully, and I understood that what he was really asking was not what happened. He was asking me why. 19 months later, all 4,000 colonists were alive. They had rationed existing food stores with a precision that the Volkai, reviewing the records afterward, described as irrational discipline. They had stripped and processed every non-essential synthetic material in the colony for nutritional conversion. They had developed 7 new protein synthesis methods, 2 of which were later adopted as standard emergency protocol across 12 council species. And somewhere around month 8, according to recovered communications, they had held a cooking competition. The challenge category was most edible thing made from materials technically not intended to be eaten. I did not tell Veth this last part immediately. I let him finish the clinical summary. Colony survived. Supply lines restored. Colonists required 6 weeks of supplementary nutrition post-blockade and then returned to standard operational status. Return to standard operational status, I repeated. Correct. In 6 weeks. Correct. I nodded slowly. They adapted. The Volkai representative on the council, a large angular creature named Kethvor who had the kind of stillness that things at the top of a food chain develop over generations, made a sound that my translation chip rendered as a low and sustained note. It was, I had learned, the Volkai equivalent of unease. They did not adapt, Kethvor said. Adaptation implies reluctance, implies resistance. The records show no resistance response. Colonists reported that the experience was, and I translate directly from recovered communications, interesting. He said the word like it tasted wrong. Interesting, he said again. A 19-month resource deprivation event that should have resulted in species termination, and they found it interesting. Dr. Owen Farr won the cooking competition, I said. Everyone looked at me. Month 8, I said. He made a casserole out of synthetic binding material and hydration gel. It was not good by most standards, but it was technically edible, and he documented the recipe. It was later published in an emergency nutrition journal. It has been cited 6 times. Kethvor made the unease sound again, lower this time. We moved to the second incident. Sethani Research Station 9, in the Theta Corridor. A human science outpost attached to the station under a joint research agreement. The station had been struck during a territorial dispute, and the structural integrity of the human section had been reduced to 40%. Veth paused a fraction of a second on the word struck, and I filed that pause and I moved on. 17 human researchers survived. Standard procedure, Veth said carefully, for all council species in a 40% integrity structure is immediate evacuation and abandonment. Continuing operations in such conditions is classified as non-survivable risk behavior. Right, I said. The 17 researchers did not evacuate. No, they continued their research. I nodded. On schedule, Veth added, with the air of a being who had reviewed this document many times and still found this particular detail the most confusing part. The 17 researchers had conducted a full damage assessment, identified which sections of the station were still functional, moved their equipment, and kept working. One of them, Dr. Nora Callum, a name I recognized from published papers, had submitted her findings on deep space mineral resonance patterns to a peer-reviewed journal 3 weeks after the structural event. She had included, in the acknowledgments section, a note thanking the structural damage for clearing the eastern wing and improving the acoustic conditions for her resonance equipment. She thanked the damage, Councillor Preth of the Dreth said. Preth was 3 meters tall and built like a question mark, and he spoke in the plural because the Dreth were never entirely one individual. She found the event useful. Nora has always been efficient, I said. You know her. I know of her. She came up in my training as a case study. I paused. Good papers. The Dreth made a sound like wind through a very thin gap. I did not have a translation for it. I decided not to ask. The third incident. Corporal Nina Hale, human soldier, captured during a border conflict and held at a Dreth containment facility for 8 months. Conditions were described in the report as non-optimal for human physiology, which was the Council's careful way of saying the facility had not been built for humans and no adjustments had been made. Month 2, Nina had begun learning the Dreth operational language. Not to communicate requests, not as part of an escape attempt. The report was very specific about this, because the Dreth had studied her motivation extensively and had ultimately concluded that she had learned it out of pure boredom, because there was nothing else to do. because a human being, sealed in a room with no stimulation, had encountered a new language filtering through the walls and had decided that learning it was a reasonable way to fill time. By month 3, she was having conversations with the facility staff. Not hostile conversations, not resistance conversations. Conversations about language structure, about the facility's history, about a staff member named Velpreth who had a young hatchling at home and was worried about developmental delays. Nina had apparently had opinions about developmental delays. She had shared them. Velpreth had found them helpful. By month 5, Nina was correcting the grammar of 3 facility staff members who had requested her corrections because they were studying a dialect that Nina, through 8 months of wall filtering and observation, had become more proficient in than they were. Month 8, the facility administrator reviewed the situation and authorized her release. Not because of external pressure, not because of negotiation, not because anyone had asked. Because Nina had become, in the administrator's words per the report, operationally inconvenient to continue holding. She had built a social context that made her continued imprisonment structurally awkward for the facility. She had not done this strategically. She had done it because she was curious, and it had not occurred to her to be otherwise. She walked out. Nobody stopped her. 3 staff members came out to say goodbye. The chamber was quiet again after Veth finished. I looked at him. He looked at me. In each case, he said, the probability of survival was below 12%, according to our models, according to all council standard models. He paused. Your species did not appear to calculate this. In the Kepler case, no probability assessment was filed. In the station case, no evacuation decision tree was activated. In the containment case, no survival protocol was initiated. We reviewed all records. There is no evidence that any of these humans performed standard survival calculations. I looked at him for a moment. They calculated, I said. He waited. They always calculate. I set my thermos down on the floor next to my chair. Every single one of them knew the odds. Nora knew what 40% structural integrity meant. Nina knew what 8 months in an unsupported facility meant for a human body. I paused. They knew. The chamber sat with that. They just did not consider the odds binding. Kethvor made a sound I had never heard from a Vokai before. It was not the unease note. It was something lower, something older. I thought they finally understand the question they have been asking. I thought they are not going to enjoy the answer. Recess was called after the 3rd incident. The council needed time to confer, and I needed to find a hydration station because my terrible coffee was gone, and I was running on professional composure and the specific stubbornness that develops in 12-hour shifts when you have been awake too long, but the work is not finished. The antechamber was a wide, high-ceilinged space designed to accommodate species with very different ideas about personal territory. Lots of room, low ambient sound, the kind of architecture that says, nobody has to be uncomfortable here. Kethvor found me at the hydration station anyway. He did not appear suddenly. Large things that have evolved as predators do not appear suddenly. They simply occupy space in a way that makes you aware, after the fact, that the space was unoccupied before. One moment I was alone with a cup of water and the distant hum of the station. The next moment Kethvor was close enough that I could see the light catch the angles of his outer plating. He was 7 feet of layered chitin and compressed military history. His species had been fighting territorial campaigns since before humans had agriculture. They had not lost a contested engagement in 300 years. They were the thing in the dark that other species used to frighten their young. He leaned forward, not dramatically, just enough. The way something that knows it does not need to try very hard leans forward when it wants to make a point. He said something in Vokai that my translation chip took a beat longer than usual to process. When it came back, it rendered as, Small, soft creature, you are prey that has learned to form words. The other delegates in the antechamber went still. I had not noticed how many of them were in the room until they all stopped moving at the same time. Preth and two Dreth support staff near the far wall. Two Sethani junior counselors near the entrance. A pale architect observer, who had been present all morning in a way that felt less like attendance and more like study, standing very still near the east side of the room. All of them watching. I understood what this was. It was a test. The council had not called an emergency session at 0300 to ask questions they did not already have frameworks for. They had brought me here because they needed to see something that their files could not capture. Data is data. A file is a file. But watching a human respond to a direct threat in real time was a different kind of information. They wanted to see what we did. I looked at Kethvor. He was not wrong, technically. We are soft, comparatively. We do not have his plating or his reach or his 300 years of undefeated history. By the numbers, we are not the most physically formidable species at this station. We have always known this. We have known it since we first left our own solar system and started encountering things that were bigger and older, and by every measurable standard, more built for this universe than we are. We know. That has never been the part that stopped us. I laughed. Not a short, polite social laugh. Not the careful diplomatic chuckle that says I acknowledge your point while maintaining appropriate distance. Full, genuine laughter. The kind that takes up room. The kind that comes from somewhere real. It echoed a little off the antechamber ceiling. "Oh, honey," I said. I stepped forward, not back, and I reached out and I patted his arm. His arm was roughly the circumference of my torso. His outer plating alone was harder than most structural materials I had handled in my career. I patted it twice. "We know," I said. "We have always known. That has never been the part that stopped us." I stepped back, picked up my water cup and took a drink. Kethvor stepped back. One step. Involuntary. I know involuntary movement. 6 years of emergency medicine teaches you the difference between a gesture someone chooses and a gesture a body makes before the mind has a chance to weigh in. This was the second kind. His body had made a decision before his thinking had caught up with it. He had stepped away from me. The antechamber was so quiet I could hear the hydration station cycling in the corner. I watched the understanding move across him. Not embarrassment, because Volkai physiology did not process embarrassment the way ours did. Something adjacent. The specific disorientation of a predator that has triggered a prey response in itself. He did not know why. I knew why. I had not been afraid. That was part of it, but not the whole of it. He had issued a threat and I had done the math. The math every human does automatically and faster than conscious thought. And I had already finished the math before he finished the threat. The result of the math was, I know. I know exactly what you are and exactly what you can do and exactly what the range of outcomes looks like in this room. And then the math was done, filed, complete. I had moved on. There was nothing left for his threat to do. It had arrived in a room where the work was already finished. His intimidation had no foothold because I had already been there and already left. He was standing in an empty space. That is the thing that does not translate. That is the thing that does not appear in any file the council had assembled over 7 years of study. It is not that we are fearless. I was aware, clearly and specifically, of what Kethvor's presence represented. I was aware of the physics of the situation. But we do not stop at the math. We do the math and then we decide whether the math matters. Usually we decide it does not. And something in the ancient wiring of any predator, no matter how evolved, no matter how many centuries of dominance behind it, recognizes that particular quality. Something deep in the instincts registers a creature that has looked at the odds and decided the odds are beside the point. The signal says, "This one is different." The signal says, "Step back." I finished my water and set the cup in the recycling slot. "We should get back in there," I said. "I think there are 14 more incidents in the file." Kethvor said nothing. He walked back toward the chamber ahead of me and did not turn around to check if I was following, which I appreciated. The pretense that the last 30 seconds had been unremarkable was a gift, and I accepted it without comment. The pale architect observer had not moved throughout the entire exchange. They had been standing near the wall the way mountains stand near roads, present and patient and operating on a different scale entirely. As I passed them on my way back into the chamber, they made a single sound. My translation chip did not convert it. I flagged it for later analysis. The flag came back 3 seconds later, closest known translation approximate only, as documented. As if they had expected exactly this. As if they had seen it before. I thought about 62 civilizations, observed across the full length of existence. I thought about the fact that the pale architects had broken 2 centuries of silence to make sure humanity was on the agenda before anyone made a decision they could not take back. I thought, they have watched something like us before, maybe. I thought, I wonder how that went. Veth called the session back to order. His 3 active limbs were very still. "We have 14 remaining incidents," he said. "I know," I said. "Let us keep going." We got through the remaining 14 incidents in 2 hours. I will not walk through all of them here. Some are classified. Some are complicated in ways that do not compress well into a linear account. But the shape of the pattern laid out one incident after another was so consistent that by incident 9, I noticed Kethvor's outer plating shifting texture. A subtle change. The Voakai equivalent of gripping the edge of your seat. By incident 14, the chamber had developed the kind of atmosphere that good weather systems and arriving news share. A pressure everyone in the room can feel building, but that nobody names out loud. Veth set down his display controls and looked at me. "Delegate Voss," he said, "we have reviewed the data. We have conducted 3 independent assessments. We have consulted 7 species analytical frameworks and applied them sequentially to the human case. Every assessment returns the same result, the same empty field where a threat classification should be." He paused. "I would like to ask you a direct question, and I would like to request a direct answer." "Go ahead," I said. "What is the source of it?" He spread 2 of his 3 active limbs in the Sethani gesture that means, "I am asking about the root, not the branches. You are not the strongest species in this room. You are not the longest lived. You do not share consciousness. You cannot heal damage at the rates that several council species can. You cannot perceive the electromagnetic ranges that give others their navigational and social advantages. Your technology, while functional, does not exceed the standard of 8 of the 16 council-recognized civilizations." He paused. "And yet the species that have been in this galaxy 10 times longer than you have filed formal fear assessments. I have been alive for 8,000 years. I have watched civilizations rise and fall and rebuild and fall again. And I cannot assign your species a value. I would like to know why." I was quiet for a moment. I thought about the right way to answer this. Not the diplomatic answer. Not the response that would land smoothly in the official record and be cited at future sessions. The true answer. The thing that was actually at the bottom of all those incident reports and all those empty classification fields and all that Voakai unease and Dreth non-consensus and pale architect attention. "Every species in this room," I said, "survives because you calculate." I looked around the chamber as I said it, all the tears, all the careful ancient faces. You run the odds, you model the scenarios, you identify the probability threshold below which survival becomes unlikely, and when you reach that threshold, you make rational decisions. You pull back, you redirect resources, you accept a controlled loss in order to preserve the core. I paused. That is correct behavior. It makes complete sense. It has kept every one of you alive through thousands of years of territorial conflict and resource competition, and the kinds of existential pressures that have eliminated species without that rational framework. Veth watched me. We do that too, I said. Every single one of us. We build models. We run assessments. When our people are planning operations, they calculate the odds the same way yours do. I let a beat go by. And then they decide the odds are someone else's problem. The chamber was very still. It is not that we do not see the threshold. We see it clearly. We identify it. We know exactly what it means. I leaned forward slightly. We simply do not consider it binding. Counselor Preth made the win-through gap sound again. I had asked my translation chip to work on that sound during the recess. It had returned its best approximation, the Dreth equivalent of cognitive resistance, the sound a collective consciousness makes when it encounters an idea it cannot fully process. Explain the distinction, Preth said. A threshold tells you what is likely, I said. It tells you what the model predicts. It tells you what has happened to other things in comparable situations. I paused. It does not tell you what is possible, and we have a very hard time caring about likely when possible is still open. Kethvor made a sound, not the unease note from earlier, something I did not have a translation for, something that felt older. The colonists on Kepler 442b, I said. They knew the odds. They knew what 19 months of resource deprivation meant for 4,000 humans with what they had on hand. They ran the math. The math said the threshold had been crossed. And then Owen Farr looked at the math and asked, all right, but what can we do with what we have? And the answer turned out to be considerably more than the math suggested, because math describes what has been done before. It does not describe what a specific group of specific stubborn people will build when they have no other option, and also, apparently, an excess of competitive spirit. I thought I saw something shift in Veth's expression. 8,000 years of watching civilizations. He had heard a lot of explanations. I wondered if any of them had sounded quite like this one. Dr. Nora Callum in the station, I continued. She knew the building was compromised. She ran the calculation, and then she looked at her data and her equipment and the Eastern Wing and made a different decision because the data was still there and the question she was trying to answer was still there, and the structural damage did not change either of those two facts. She is not reckless. She is stubborn about the things that matter to her. There is a difference between those two things. And Corporal Hale, Veth said quietly. Nina was in a situation where the odds said she would not make it out intact. She looked at those odds and thought, fine, but what is interesting about this room? What can I learn? What can I do with the time I have, on the chance that the time does not end when the odds say it should? I paused. She learned a language. She made a friend. She found out that Velpreth's young one was probably just a late developer and had nothing genuinely wrong. And then she walked out. The chamber sat with that. In English, I said, we have two words. They are not the same word, but they live very close to each other, and in the dark they look alike. I paused. One of them is spite. The other is love. Spite says, the odds say I cannot do this, and I am going to do it anyway because I will not give the odds the satisfaction. Love says, the odds say I cannot do this, and I am going to do it anyway because the thing on the other side of those odds matters more to me than the calculation. I leaned back in my chair. You cannot build a threat model around a species operating on spite and love simultaneously, because neither one has a predictable upper limit. They do not plateau. They do not respond to pressure by retreating. They respond to pressure by deciding the pressure is offensive and increasing accordingly. Veth was very still. That is why your models return an empty field, I said. You are trying to assign a value to something that does not cap. A long silence settled over the chamber. Then Kethvor spoke. His voice had changed from the beginning of the session, something in the resonance of it. You are telling us that your species would do more if the situation were more serious. Yes, that your current documented behavior represents a baseline, Yes. He paused. His plating shifted again. I had a sudden and genuine sympathy for him. He had spent his entire existence being the most dangerous presence in any room he entered. He had 300 years of military history and the documented fear of every species the Volkai had ever encountered. And he was sitting here listening to a mid-tier diplomat from a short-lived, soft-bodied, 200-year spacefaring species tell him that everything in the file was Tuesday. "You have not been seriously threatened," he said. It was not quite a question. "No," I said. "And when you are?" I met his gaze. He had multiple optical sensors arranged in a band across the upper plating of his face. I could not read them the way I could read a human face, but I held the look anyway. "You have never seen us when something we love is at stake," I said. I did not elaborate. I did not explain what I meant by something we love. I did not give examples. I did not describe the distinction between baseline and peak, or paint a picture of what it looks like when a species running on spite and love gets its back against a wall, and the thing on the other side is a person and not a calculation. I let it sit in the chamber air. White space, the timing doing the work. Veth made a notation. Preth was silent. Kethvor looked at me for a long moment. The pale architect observer, who had said nothing all day and had been present in the room, the way very old things are present, still and patient and watching, made a sound. The translation chip came back without flagging it as approximate. It said, "We know." Just those two words. From something that had watched 62 civilizations live and end, and that had broken 2 centuries of silence to make sure humanity was discussed before anyone made a decision they could not undo. "We know." I picked up my empty thermos and looked at it. I thought, I need a refill. I thought, I hope that was a vote of confidence. I thought, I think it might have been a warning. Both things maybe at the same time. Spite and love looking alike in the dark. The news came in at 41 minutes past midnight, 14 days after the council session. I was asleep, which almost never happened at midnight, but I had been awake for 31 hours before that, and my body had made a unilateral decision about the situation without consulting me. I was asleep, and then I was not asleep, because my communication panel was running the code that means, not optional. Not a message, a broadcast, pushed to every diplomatic channel simultaneously. I sat up and read it in the blue light of the panel, and I read it twice, and then I sat with it for a moment in the dark of my quarters on Relay Station Orin, and I thought, very clearly and very calmly, well, isn't that something? 3 systems. Karath 7, the Marathi Home System, and Vel Crossing, a trade and transit hub that had been operational for 600 years and had, at any given time, somewhere between 40 and 80,000 residents of 14 different species moving through it. Gone. Not attacked, not damaged, not occupied. Gone in the sense that the probe sent to verify the first reports had returned data that the Council's analytical teams had spent 11 days arguing over before releasing the broadcast, because the data did not conform to anything in the existing models for what weapons or natural events or cosmic phenomena could produce. The planets were still there. The stars were still there. The physical mass of 3 solar systems remained present and accounted for. There was no sound. Not silence, not the absence of radio transmission. Something more fundamental than that. The probe's acoustic sensors, which measure vibrational resonance in matter itself rather than sound in the traditional sense, returned flat lines. Every piece of matter in 3 solar systems vibrating at the same frequency, which was no frequency. A pale architect analyst, reviewing the data, had submitted 1 line of commentary before withdrawing from the assessment entirely. The line read, "We have seen this before, it is not a weapon, it is a statement." The Galactic Council convened at 0600. I had been awake since the broadcast, and I arrived with good coffee this time, From a reserve I kept for situations that required clarity, and I took my seat, and I looked at the faces and the tears around me. I did the thing I had learned in emergency medicine. Read the room before you speak, because the room is already telling you something important. The room was telling me that the council was afraid. Not the careful, analytical, we are being rational about a concerning development kind of afraid. Afraid the way that very old and very wise things get afraid when something happens that they recognize from a place they did not expect to find it again. When something they had studied and cataloged and thought they had frameworks for reveals a completely new angle. Veth opened the session. His 3 active limbs were completely still throughout. The data was presented in full. 3 systems, the acoustic flatlines, the pale architect commentary, the complete absence of survivor transmissions, emergency beacons, or any of the automated distress protocols that 600 years of Vel crossing infrastructure would have generated if there had been any infrastructure remaining to generate them. Then the council voted. They were orderly about it, methodical. They discussed the threat parameters in careful detail. They modeled possible trajectories. They estimated resource requirements for various response options. They identified the probable origin vector of whatever had done this and calculated the risk to council space if it continued on that vector without opposition. And then they voted to observe. Gather more data. Establish a containment perimeter at safe distance. Convene a joint analytical committee. Wait for better information before committing to any response that could not be reversed. It was the rational decision. I understood completely why they made it. The data was incomplete. The threat was unclassified. Committing forces to an engagement with an entity they did not yet understand was exactly the kind of decision that long-lived rational civilizations had learned not to make, because the civilizations that had made it were not here anymore to discuss whether it had been wise. I understood the logic fully. I sat in my chair and I understood the logic, and I watched the vote finalize, and I thought about Councillor Veltath. I had met Veltath of the Marathi at the Kepler Trade Summit 16 months ago. He was a mid-tier trade delegate, not a senior counselor. The Marathi had not yet achieved full council standing, which was one of those slow, bureaucratic processes that moved on timelines designed for civilizations with longer lifespans than ours. He had been at a side event on resource exchange protocols. I had been at the same event because my rotation included trade-adjacent work, and also because the food at that event was significantly better than anything else available at the summit. Veltath had found me near the food service area and had, without any particular preamble, shown me photographs. 17 of them. His hatchlings. They had emerged 3 months prior, which was, in Marathi development, roughly equivalent to newborn. They were small and very pink, and had enormous eyes clearly designed by evolution to trigger protective responses in any species that encountered them, because I had encountered them via a photograph in the middle of a trade summit, and had immediately felt a strong interest in their continued well-being. I spent 40 minutes looking at photographs of Veltath's hatchlings and listening to him describe their individual personalities with the particular enthusiasm of a parent who needs the whole world to understand that his offspring are exceptional. Specifically, his offspring, not hatchlings in general. The one on the left was already showing navigational instincts a full 3 months ahead of developmental milestones. The one in the middle was showing strong social bonding behaviors. The smallest one, the one he called Rith, had developed a pattern of following Veltath himself around the nesting area and making a specific sound whenever he left the room. I told him they were beautiful. I meant it. Rith's system was now a place where matter did not vibrate and sound did not exist. The council had just voted to gather more data. I left the chamber. I did not make a scene. I walked out with the same flat, professional expression I had worn since I was 22 years old, and first learned that the world would keep presenting you with situations you could either fall apart over or file and keep moving. I filed it. Then I kept moving to the communications room on the station's residential level, which had private channels technically reserved for personal and family use. I had used them exactly twice in 3 years. Once to let my sister know I had arrived safely on Orin. Once during the Kareth border dispute to confirm a colleague had reached evacuation. I pulled up the Earth channel. The connection took 42 seconds to root. Encryption handshake. Authentication. Station relay across 14 light minutes of distance. I watched the progress indicator and I drank my good coffee, and I thought about Rith following Veltath around the nesting area and making sounds whenever he left the room. The channel opened. The voice on the other end was Calvin Marsh, Earth Diplomatic Command Overnight Duty Officer. I did not know Cal particularly well. He was 3 years into the Corps, young, very capable on the technical side, still working out the parts that technical training does not cover. He answered with his standard duty greeting and then stopped, because he had looked at his panel and seen my identifier and the channel I was calling from. "Mara," he said. "You saw the broadcast," I said. "Yes." "The Marathi system is gone, Cal." A pause short, he knew. Of course he knew. Everyone on every station in range had seen the broadcast. "I know," he said. "I met Veltath at the Kepler summit 16 months ago. He showed me photographs of his hatchlings for 40 minutes. There were 17 of them." I paused. "The smallest one was named Rith." Cal was quiet. "He was very proud of them," I said. A longer pause this time. "Yeah," Cal said. His voice had gone careful, the way voices go when they are holding something and keeping it steady. "Yeah, we know." In the background on his end, I could hear the particular quality of a room containing a lot of people who are not making noise. Not a calm room. A room full of people being very deliberately still. "The council voted to observe," I said. "We know that too," Cal said. "I am going to file a formal report. Independent human assessment request. I will have it done in 2 hours." "Mara," he paused, "the assessment has already been done." I stopped. "It was completed about 6 hours ago," he said, "when the first confirmed data came in, before the council vote." I set down my coffee. "Cal," I said. "Yeah." "How many ships?" He told me. I sat with the number, just for a moment. It was larger than I had expected, and I had been expecting a large number because I had been a human being for 34 years, and I had come to understand certain things about my species, including the thing that the council had spent an entire formal session trying to quantify and had failed to capture in any file. We had not been pushed yet. Not really. Everything in the incident reports, the blockade and the ruined station and the prisoner teaching herself a language out of boredom, that had been baseline. That had been us on a regular day in circumstances that were difficult, but not the specific kind of difficult that crosses a particular line. The line is not about survival. The line is about what you love. A threat to survival, and we respond with everything that smart, stubborn, creative people do when the odds are against them. Inventive, relentless, darkly funny about it, probably. Owen Farr would document the whole thing and submit a paper with comprehensive footnotes. But Veltath had shown me 17 photographs. Rith had followed him around the nesting area. Something had come out of the dark between the mapped stars and decided that those 17 hatchlings and their father and their entire species and 40,000 residents of Vel Crossing and every living thing in the Kareth system were a statement worth making. Not a battle, not even a conquest. A statement. We were not okay with that. We were not going to become okay with that. The word is spite. The word is love. In the dark they look alike, and in the moment they come together they are the same thing, and neither one of them has an upper limit, and neither one of them considers the odds binding. Okay, I said. The council is going to object to the deployment, Cal said. I know. It may create significant diplomatic complications. I know, Cal. The threat profile is completely unclassified. We have no data on what we are heading toward. I know. A pause. Mara, do you want me to flag your report as a formal advisory? You are the senior diplomat on Orin. Your assessment would carry weight in the record. I thought about that. I thought about the Galactic Council and their careful rational models and their empty classification fields in Kethvor, stepping back one involuntary step in the antechamber of his own volition. I thought about the pale architect observer in a chamber full of ancient civilizations, saying two words. We know. No, I said. No advisory. What we are doing is correct. File my departure from Orin and put me on the crew manifest for the nearest departure point. Cal's pause was slightly longer than all the others. Then, yes, ma'am. I closed the channel. I sat in the communications room for a moment, just long enough to finish my coffee, which had gone slightly cool but was still the good kind. Long enough to look out the small viewport at the dark between the stars where something was waiting that had removed 3 solar systems and called it a statement. Long enough to feel, clearly and without any confusion about it, exactly what I felt. I was not afraid. I was something considerably more specific than afraid. The kind of feeling that does not have a direct translation in any of the Council's 17 official languages, but that every human knows from the inside. The cold, clear, very precise feeling of something becoming unacceptable, not dangerous, not threatening. Unacceptable. The feeling that comes before the decision. The feeling that is already the decision, already made, already done, already filed in that place in the back of your mind where things go when the math is finished and you have moved on. I thought about Rith. I stood up. I had a bag already packed. That is one of the things that 6 years of emergency work teaches you, alongside reading a room and developing useful expressions for difficult situations. Always have a bag ready, because the moment that requires it will not wait while you prepare. I walked out of the communications room and down the corridor toward the docking ring. Somewhere behind me, in the formal chamber where the ancient and careful and rational civilizations of the galaxy were convening committees and establishing perimeters and building analytical frameworks for what came next, Veth was conducting a session I was no longer attending. Kethvor was sitting with his stress-shifted plating and 300 years of undefeated history, building a model for a situation that did not fit inside the existing models. Preth was making the wind-through gap sound at irregular intervals. The pale architect observer was watching, taking notes perhaps, adding to a record that stretched back across 62 civilizations and the full span of things the galaxy had produced. Writing down, and then the humans decided the odds were someone else's problem. Writing down, and then they went. The docking ring was occupied and orderly. Ships cycling through, crew manifests updating, departure clearances being filed in the steady bureaucratic rhythm of a station that did not yet fully understand that the shape of things had changed. I walked through it with my bag and my empty thermos and my flat professional expression, and I found my departure point, and I got in line. The person ahead of me was a young crew member I did not know, human, maybe 23, a communication pin from one of the Frontier Corps units on his collar, the kind of posture that belongs to someone who has been told they are good at what they do and has started to believe it, which is the right thing to believe about yourself when you are 23 and about to go somewhere like this. He turned around when I stepped into line behind him and recognized my diplomatic insignia on my jacket. "Ma'am," he said, professional, slightly uncertain the way young people are uncertain before the job teaches them to measure everything. "At ease," I said. He relaxed by a small amount, Then, because he was young and honest in the way that has not yet been refined into caution, "You heard." "I heard." "3 systems," he said. "3 systems," I confirmed. He was quiet for a moment, processing it, running the math the way we all run the math, the way we have always run the math from the moment we understood what math was. Then he said, "Well." Just that one word. He turned back around and faced the front of the line. I looked at the back of his head and I thought, yes, exactly, well. That is the entire thing, right there in one syllable. That is the complete answer I had spent a full day trying to explain to a chamber full of ancient civilizations that could not find us in any classification system they had ever built. The math runs. The threshold gets crossed. We look at it. And we say, well. And then we go. The line moved forward. The dark between the stars was still out there, in every direction, where something had made a statement using 3 solar systems as its medium. We had received the statement. We were not impressed. We were on our way.